Thank everyone for joining us today. We have this is the first in a series of sessions that we're going to have spread out throughout the both this fall and the spring. So there'll be 4 sessions all about teaching essentials. So today we have 3 faculty in our Department of Medical Education. I should introduce myself. I'm Ken Kramer. I'm chair of the Department of Medical Education. So 3 faculty in the department. Dr. GB is going to start off. GB teaches most of the embryology, all the embryology actually to our first and second year medical students, as well as our PA students here in Omaha. And Jeff Lang and Kylie Madhavan, they are part of our team here in the Department of Medical Education, and they're also part of student affairs here in Omaha. So they'll tell you all about their strategies for student success. So thanks again, and I'll pass it off to you, GB.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I assume everyone can hear me if I speak at this volume. Good. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, so this session is on student success, and the 3 of us will be presenting this session. I will present my part from the perspective of a teacher, and Jeff and Kylie will present theirs from the perspective of academic success consultants. So as Ken mentioned earlier, I just to introduce myself, I teach embryology and histology to first and second year medical students, and I also participate in some CBLs and TBLs. So my teaching experience in the medical school is limited to the first 2 years, but nonetheless, what I'll be talking about will be broadly applicable to years beyond the pre-clerkship years, and also to pretty much any teaching modality. So these are the topics I will talk about. So I will begin with an overview of the organization of human cognitive architecture. Then I will go over cognitive load theory and its implications. Then I'll briefly describe the 3 types of cognitive loads and general ways of optimizing cognitive loads. So it'll take me about, 20, 25 minutes to get through this. At the outset, I should mention that I don't make any claims of originality here. All these ideas have been known for some time, and there's considerable literature on this topic. So my goal here is to try and draw your attention to some aspects of learning that I think are often neglected in modern pedagogy. And this, I feel, at times can be detrimental to student success. So before I get into cognitive load theory, I would like to begin by playing you a short video clip. So this is a video clip of Magnus Carlsen. Many of you may already recognize this person. So Magnus Carlsen is a 5-time world chess champion, and he's highly regarded in the chess world as one of the great grandmasters in the modern era. And the setup is, so he's interviewed by this other person who arranges chess pieces on a board based on some past games. And then Magnus Carlsen is asked to identify that game. So let me play this. If you will bear with me, I'll share this. Now, the video is about 3.5 minutes long. So in the interest of time, I'll play only the first 40, 45 seconds. The audio is a bit muffled, so I'll keep the captions on so you can hear, you can see what's going on.
I'm now going to be showing Magnus some historical chess positions. Let's see if he recognizes them. This position, I bet it looks familiar.
Yeah, this looks an awful lot like Tal Botvinnik. I think the continuation here was probably Queen d5 and then Rook a6 and Tal 1.
Yes. Whoops.
Okay, this is the 24th game from Seville, obviously.
You got that right. Shall I go on to the next one?
Okay, so you get the idea. So he is he's shown various types of positions, and his recall is almost instantaneous. And by the way, I should point out there are other YouTube videos of other grandmasters, including Kasparov and Anand and so forth, and they also display a similar type of prowess. Okay, so what is the secret of Magnus Carlsen's expertise? Well, one hypothesis is that he and people like him have extraordinary visual spatial memory, and that's the reason why he's able to recall games almost instantaneously. Well, this hypothesis was tested in Herbert Simon's lab, and this goes back to 1973. Now, I should point out this was not the first study of its kind. There were others before this, including de Groot's study in the 40s. But this is considered a classic paper, so I'll just show the findings quickly. And it includes some really elegant studies. So what Herbert Simon did was, oh, by the way, I should point out, you might be familiar with the name Herbert Simon. He went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics for something totally unrelated. So he chose three types of people: a grandmaster in chess, a beginner, and an intermediate player. And each was shown a board with some 25 pieces arranged based on some past game that was played before. And each was shown the board not more than 5 seconds. Then the board was covered, and they were asked to recreate this configuration on a new or a blank chessboard. So when the trial was run, the expert could correctly place 16 out of the 25 pieces, whereas the novice could only manage about 4, and the intermediate player about 6 or 7. And it took no more than 3 to 4 trials for the expert to get all the positions correctly, whereas the novice and the intermediate player took more attempts. So just as one would predict, the expert's performance was much superior to that of an intermediate player and novice. Now, this was the most interesting part. When the same pieces were randomized, that is, this configuration was not from some past game, but the pieces were randomly arranged, then the advantage the expert had over the intermediate player and novice completely vanished. In other words, with randomization of pieces, the expert's performance was no better than that of the intermediate player and novice. So studies like this clearly showed that even chess grandmasters, their visual spatial memory was no different than that of an average person. Okay, so if so, what is the secret of Magnus Carlsen's expertise? Now, we kind of know the answer to that question, but before I get to that, really quickly, I'll go over just the basic elements of human cognition. And this is based on a model that was proposed in 1968 by Atkinson and Schifrin. This is called the multi-store model. Now, there have been other refinements to this model, but this was what was used for framing cognitive load theory, so I'll quickly go over this. So the model proposes that essentially there are 3 stores of memory, and information is passed along in a linear fashion from one to another. And the very first store is sensory memory, and this is where perceptual information is stored. And this is quickly forgotten unless the information is paid attention to. Then information is moved to working memory, where information is held by rehearsal. And this too degrades very quickly unless it's moved to long-term memory, where it's stored for a longer period of time. Now here, psychologists use these two terms in a very specific way, encoding for moving information to long-term memory and retrieval for pulling it back into working memory. So this model was made use of by Dr. John Sweller and others to propose or frame this cognitive load theory. So this theory is based on a very simple idea. That is, working memory has a limited working capacity, and therefore it acts like a bottleneck to get information into long-term memory. Therefore, the theory states that instructional methods and approaches that best utilize the limited capacity of working memory are the ones that are most effective. And the claim was that this applies to all types of instruction, media, content, and learners. Now, I must admit, when I first read this theory, I thought this is so obvious and self-evident. I was surprised anyone would actually make the claim that this is indeed a theory. But as I read more and reflected on it, it became clear that the simplicity of this theory is very deceptive. The theory has some profound implications for learning and student success. And amazingly, these implications are often ignored in modern pedagogy, which is what I'd like to get to. But before I get there, it's very clear we understand the differences between working memory and long-term memory. The obvious difference being information is held for a shorter period of time in working memory. This is not the case in long-term memory. Now, I should point out, psychologists make a distinction between working memory and short-term memory, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to assume that they are synonymous terms, even though they are not. Another difference is working memory has a finite capacity. And again, there is some disagreement on what this is, and that I feel is a minor pedantic point, at least for this presentation. But it appears to be no more than 5 to 7 bits of information. Now, long-term memory does not seem to have any known limits that we know of. For the most part, we're only conscious of what goes on in working memory. Most of what goes on long-term memory, we're completely unconscious of. And this is by far the most important difference between the two. So information in working memory is largely disorganized, and we're talking about unrelated bits of information. Whereas in long-term memory, information is highly organized, and the term psychologists use is schemas. Now, the thing to note is once schemas form in the learner's mind, this can be a transformative experience. They will never, ever look at new information the same way. And I'll show some experimental evidence for this. And not only that, schemas greatly enhance short-term memory. In fact, once schemas form in the learner's mind, all the limitations of working memory completely disappear. And again, I'll show some experimental support for that. So I know the session is focused on student success. And if I were asked what I have in mind when I say student success, it is this. It is addition of schemas to long-term memory. Now, I don't want to speak on behalf of Kylie and Jeff, but this is my personal opinion. In my view, if there is no change to long-term memory, then the student has learned nothing. So this formation of schemas in long-term memory is going to go beyond their performance in their quizzes and exams and other types of assessments, and also step 1, step 2, and so on. Okay, so I see it as something very long-term. Now, incidentally, this also reflects the differences between a novice and an expert. A novice has no access to relevant schemas because he has not formed those schemas yet. And therefore, he attempts to remember and process individual elements. And the term psychologists use is element interactivity. Because he's not quite sure how these individual pieces relate to each other, the element interactivity is going to be very high for a novice. And therefore, he attempts to solve the problem by resorting to trial and error approach, which is highly inefficient and places considerable load on the working memory. Now, the expert, in contrast, has schemas, and he's combined them into a single entity, and is therefore skillful in applying what he's learned without having to recall the rule. And many of these processes are automated, and he can easily apply them to solve complex problems. Now, elsewhere in a different interview, and I have a link for it in my reference, Magnus Carlsen says, I know what to do. I don't need to figure it out. So this really is the secret of expertise, is formation of schemas and changes to long-term memory. Now, there's again considerable number of studies done to show this. So experts not only know more, they deal with problems differently and they solve problems differently. So what experts already know, or prior knowledge, determines what they see and how they see it. So experts differ from novices both at the level of ontology and epistemology. And this is by far the most important take-home lesson. So novices are not miniature experts. And experts may thrive without much guidance, but novices need explicit instructional support and guidance. And I say that because in at least modern pedagogy, there appears to be a concerted effort to get rid of the teacher from the classroom, as though the teacher is detrimental to learning. Now, cognitive load theory would suggest that this is not a smart idea. Now, getting a bunch of novices in a room and getting them to talk to each other and teach each other will not magically transform them into experts, unless there is an expert in the room, i.e. a teacher, who can gently guide them towards what to see and how to see so that they can form their schemas and then they'll be on the road to expertise. So, at least in my view, teacher-guided instruction is not only invaluable, but is indispensable to learning and student success. So this I feel is a very important point. And this also comports well with Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm sure you're aware of. So the upper levels of the Bloom's pyramid, as you well know, includes things like application, analysis, evaluation, and so forth. And the lower levels include remembering and understanding. Okay, even though it's not explicitly mentioned, at this time, schemas should form in the learner's mind. So we cannot leapfrog a student to the upper levels of this pyramid by skipping the lower levels, nor can we outsource this to, Khan Academy or other learning resources. This bit is extremely important, and the teacher's role in this is very critical. After all, a student cannot apply something that he or she cannot remember or understand. And yes, there's certainly room for other types of approaches to the curriculum, and struggle when we introduce it, whether it's scaffolded or independent. It's best to introduce struggle at the point of retrieval, once the schemas are formed, not at the point of encoding, not when they're seeing information for the first time. Now, quickly, I will go over a couple of lines of experimental support for the idea that prior knowledge helps in thinking about new information. So this is fairly straightforward. Essentially, subjects are shown 16 random alphabets, and they're asked to memorize it, then repeat it back. And most of them could manage about 7 or 8 of these. Now, once this comma is moved over, now suddenly a pattern emerges. Now the subjects were able to remember more alphabets. So psychologists call this chunking, as I'm sure many of you know this already. Chunking essentially being meaningful groupings of information. So for this to work, naturally, the subject must have some idea of what these abbreviations stand for. And once they have those schemas formed, then they are able to look at new information in a different way. So Simon and Gobert estimate that chess grandmasters have between 10,000 to 300,000 chess piece chunks in their memory. So not only does prior knowledge help subjects or learners look at new information in a new way, but it also helps overcome the constraints of working memory. It greatly expands working memory. And this is one of my favorite experiments that illustrates this point. So students were given a reading test, and based on their performance in the reading test, they were classified as either being good readers or poor readers. Then good readers who had no knowledge of baseball were placed in one group, and poor readers who had prior knowledge of baseball were placed in another group. Now, both these groups were given a reading comprehension test that included a passage with a description of half an inning of baseball. Now, once they read the passage, then they were asked to recreate what they read in a replica of the baseball field. Now, this passage contained a description of the shortstop throwing the ball to second baseman, who in turn threw it to the first baseman, resulting in an out both at second base and at first base. Okay, so when this test was given, the poor readers who had prior knowledge of baseball did a lot better than the so-called good readers who had no knowledge of baseball. Now, you may have already worked this out as to why this is so. So the readers who had prior knowledge of baseball chunked this information to a single element as double play. which is a term used in baseball, as you well know. So they were able to combine these elements and thereby reduce element interactivity, freeing up space in their working memory that improved their reading comprehension. Whereas readers with no prior knowledge of baseball were still dealing with individual elements, and because element interactivity was higher, this placed considerable load on their memory. So the upshot of this is, and this is from Dan Willingham, a cognitive psychologist, he puts it so well, I decided to include his entire quote. You cannot teach someone how to think without first teaching them a considerable amount of what to think. Thinking well first requires knowing a lot of stuff or prior knowledge, and there's no way around it. And this I found to be true in my own teaching experience. And I'd like to hear from others during discussion if that's also the case in your teaching experience. Now, there is also another kind of complaint which I often hear, and alarmingly also from some teachers. And the complaint goes like this: you don't need to know anything anymore. Knowing things is hopelessly 20th century, and everything you need to know is instantly available. And the examples cited are sources like Google and ChatGPT and so on. That is, students no longer need to learn these difficult subjects, and they can always look things up when needed. So essentially, the implication is the 21st century learner is fundamentally different from the learner of the previous century. Well, cognitive load theory would say this cannot be right, because an essential component of forming schemas is the ability to remember things. If they don't remember things or don't commit things to memory, then they will always be looking things up, and they will always be indulging in trial and error method type of approach. So in other words, they'll always be starting over. So they'll perpetually remain novices without ever becoming experts and solving complex problems. So even though there may be advances in the design of learning resources, thanks to these large language models, our brains and the way we process information has not fundamentally changed since the last century. So therefore, we still have to pay close attention to the demand placed on the working memory or cognitive load. So this is in a way equivalent to saying, well, we used to choose solid food, but now we have blenders. So is it reasonable to expect people to still choose solid food? So, okay. So John Sweller identifies three types of cognitive loads. One is intrinsic cognitive load, which really is the inherent difficulty of the subject being taught. This is going to depend on the number of interacting elements in the new information, plus what is already available as background knowledge in long-term memory. Naturally, this is going to be higher on novices than on advanced learners. So the goal here would be to simplify, but not eliminate the difficulty of the subject. An extrinsic cognitive load also depends on element interactivity, but this is due to the way the subject is taught or due to instructional procedures. And here there is engagement of cognitive processes that are extraneous to learning goals. So this can often distract working memory from processing new information. And the third kind is germane cognitive load. This is where the learner integrates new information with the old. So I will, in the next segment, talk about ways of optimizing these three types of cognitive load. But before I do that, really quickly, I'll go over this working memory model. Now, this was proposed by Alan Badley and Graham Itch, and this was a refinement of the multi-store model I showed earlier. So they worked with brain injury patients, and they added some more information on the components of the working memory. So starting with the central executive. So this is the part that allows us to choose one or more stimuli over competing stimuli. So this is more like a supervisor. That is, for example, as I'm speaking, and let's say your cell phone goes off or you hear a lawnmower outside, if you choose to ignore those stimuli and then pay attention to my voice, that is because of the central executive. Then the visual spatial sketchpad. So this, as the name suggests, this is a part that processes visual information. And additionally, also where objects are in relative to each other in space. So if the room you're sitting in were to lose power, and let's say everything goes dark, your ability to make your way to the door is going to depend on information stored here and where the different objects are in the room. Then phonological loop. So this is very interesting, but it's also very complex. It is not only important for processing auditory information, but it also acts more like an echo chamber. So apparently we sound out things in our heads, and this is a loop that helps with that, including, so when we see text on a slide, such as this one, let's say this alphabet W in the word walking, as we see this alphabet W or this grapheme, we convert it into a sound W by engagement of this loop. So this conversion of text to speech also occurs through here. So this part will be exploited in the principles I'll be talking about in the next slide. The episodic buffer is what communicates with the long-term memory, so it's important both for coding and retrieval. So the good news here is both of these loops, the phonological loops and visual spatial sketchpad, can be simultaneously engaged. If anything, it would be better to do it that way rather than to overload one or both of those loops. So there are a number of ways of optimizing cognitive load. This is just one of those ways. I chose this because I use it in my own teaching practice. I found it to be useful. But again, this is not the only way. This was proposed by Richard Mayer. He calls them 12 principles for multimedia presentation. And he splits them into 3 categories: essential, extraneous, and generative processing, which to go with intrinsic, extrinsic, and germane cognitive loads. And I should point out, for each of these principles, there is considerable experimental support. There are at least a dozen studies for each, and the median effect size is fairly high. So each of these principles are experimentally validated. Okay, so I'll go through this quickly because most of these are common sense. I'm sure most of you are doing this already, and you have a very good idea of why they work the way they do. Starting with the multimedia principle, this is that students learn better when words and visuals are presented rather than either words alone or pictures alone. And mostly because just by presenting just the text alone, it overloads the phonological loop, and so therefore the cognitive load increases. Then the coherence principle, this is essentially this to reduce extraneous cognitive load. So basically deletion of extraneous information, and to present words and visuals as being closely aligned, or at least they should complement each other, either on a slide or on a printed text. The signaling principle, this is to, again, reduce extraneous cognitive load, and students learn better if they're explicitly shown what to pay attention to, either on a slide or on a printed page, by use of highlights or by, arrows and other kinds of cues. Redundancy principle. So this is based on the idea that students learn better when they see graphics plus narration than graphics plus narration plus on-screen text. So the redundancy here refers to the narration and the on-screen text being the same thing. So this again will overload the phonological loop because the learner is hearing what the speaker is narrating, and also converting this text into speech through the phonological loop. So that overloading can be a bit much. Now, naturally, there are some exceptions to this rule. I'm sure you've thought of this already. So if students are hearing impaired, for instance, it would be better to include some text on the slide. And additionally, in medical school, when we all teach complex subjects and there are long multisyllabic terms, for example, coagulative necrosis or, paradoxical embolism and things of that kind. So it would be better to include those terms as text on a slide. So these are exceptions to the rule, and Richard Mayer himself recognizes all of these exceptions. He calls them boundary value conditions. So one thing to keep in mind is these are all guidelines and they're not to be used as a checklist. So then spatial contiguity principle, this is also to reduce extraneous cognitive load based on the idea that it's best to keep graphics and text closely, at least to be spatially contiguous on the slide and not separate them either on a slide or on a page. Temporal contiguity principle, this is the idea that words and pictures are better if they are presented simultaneously than sequentially. So this will apply more for micro-learning and e-learning procedures. The audio and the video has to be in sync. Segmenting principle, this is to reduce the intrinsic cognitive load, especially for difficult subjects. It's best information is presented in segments or step-by-step or in sequence. And for e-learning and micro-learning, studies show that it would be better to cede control to the students so that they can control the pace of instruction. So they can pause, start, replay, and so on, and go from one segment to another at their own pace. Now, again, this has to be taken with a pinch of salt. I'm sure most of you have experienced this already. So in medical schools, our lectures are recorded and posted on Bluecast, and typically students play our lectures at twice or thrice the speed. So again, so this has to be approached with caution. Pre-training principle, again, this is to reduce intrinsic cognitive load. Especially for difficult subjects, it may not be a bad idea to present an overview of key concepts before the lecture. And many lecturers do this already as pre-walk. Again, a note of caution, it's very important that this guide or this pre-walk is done in a very thoughtful way, because if students read this guide and then they come to the lecture hall misunderstanding this information, then they come in with preconceived ideas, and now the teacher's workload doubles. The teacher has to make the student unlearn what he or she has learned incorrectly and then teach them the right thing. So it goes without saying, the teacher has to put in considerable effort into preparing this guide. The modality principle, essentially the idea that students learn better with graphics and narration rather than graphics and on-screen text without any kind of narration. This is fairly obvious. Voice principle, the human voice is definitely better than machine narrated voice. And again, the audio quality has to be high as well. As many of us know, we are at the mercy of classroom technology. Personalization principle, this, again, the studies show that students learn better when the tone of presentation is informal or conversational rather than being formal. And the last one, image principle. This is a bit controversial. There is some disagreement on this. The studies show that students don't necessarily learn better when they see a picture of the instructor in the video or a talking head video. There is some disagreement here. Some people feel that it is better for learners to see the instructor's face, at least early on, to establish trust and credibility. And perhaps learners could be weaned off as the course progresses. I don't have any strong convictions on this. I think there is room for both types of approaches. And I'm sure some of you already have experience with this, and it would be nice to hear from some of you as to what you feel about this. And I've included some references. So with that, I'll stop and I'll hand this over to Jeff so he can tell us more about managing cognitive load.